Welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program. Thank you for tuning in wherever you are and wherever you may be. I'm Daniel Davis, and we've got a wonderful program ahead for you today. As many of you approach midlife, you find yourselves wondering, where's that happiness that I yearn for by the time I reach the middle years? Sometimes we get used to doing things that we've always done, followed paths we were told to follow, and find ourselves with a lot of discontent and unhappiness. Some of us even go a little bit further, perhaps growing ourselves into the darkest areas of our souls and ourselves and wondering if we're ever going to get out. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program is someone who actually found herself in the sort of shadows, if you will, of 4 years of darkness, just before having a daughter and planning on marrying her daughter's father. She tried to figure out how she could navigate through this, but found herself doing the emotional work that was necessary and also led workshops on the topic as well. And she was plagued with such depths that she thought that maybe it was a hormonal issue. Perhaps it was a psychological issue. Whatever those are, she's going to be giving us some of those answers today, and to allow us to know that no matter how dark things get, if you're willing to continue in faith to take one step at a time, you'll find yourself toward the light. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our special guest, Jeannie Zandi. Jeannie, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for having me.
You know, it's rare that people really talk about what could be considered the dark night of the soul. Tell us about what happened here with you.
Well, when I was about 36 or so, 38, I think it was, suddenly it felt as though the world turned into the underworld. Is the best way to describe it. All the things that I was interested in prior, I was no longer interested in. I felt it wasn't so much a depression as it was some kind of sense that something deep was wrong, and I couldn't find an answer. My body had a lot of anxiety in it. And it started before I was pregnant with my daughter, so I couldn't blame it on pregnancy hormones. And it continued about 4 years after. Nothing made sense. And as I tried to figure out, because I was a very analytical person, and as I tried to figure out what the heck was happening, and as I found no solution and no control over my state, which was one of feeling terrified at some level, I started to go into a kind of a deep despair. And I looked around for answers. I looked around for what's wrong. I barked up every tree, trying to find what was going on. And nothing really described what was happening to me until I read St. John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul and found myself described there.
Now, what was it in St. John of the Cross that you had read that triggered you to realize, wow, here's a kindred spirit, so to speak?
Well, it was interesting. One of the things he said in that book, he describes everything turning dark, no way out. He described how no one in the dark night of the soul believes they are virtuous enough to deserve the dark night of the soul. As my friend Kim said, if you have a nice spiritual perspective in the middle of the dark night of the soul, it's not a dark night of the soul. Every single theory gets ripped away from you, your sense of God, your sense of holiness. And he was basically describing that. And I still, as he said, I didn't believe that that's what was happening to me. I actually concluded that I must be mentally ill and that it was just a late onset or something.
Mm-hmm. Or almost a super midlife crisis, in other words.
Yeah, I told my dad, he said, what did happen to you? And he's not a particularly spiritual person. And I said, a midlife crisis on steroids, basically.
Ah. Now, I'm curious, Jeannie, during this time, if you could kind of describe what your thought process was. What did you find yourself, I guess, saying to yourself in your thoughts? One of the issues or things that I love to talk with people about, especially, here on the program when it comes to, I guess, neurophysiology is you hear, for instance, we become what we think.
Yeah.
Now, give us an idea, if you could remember, to the best of your ability, what that was like. What were you thinking? What was the noise or the brain chatter, the talking that you had going on there?
Okay. Well, when this thing hit, and it was a very odd experience I had never had before. There was a feeling that I was being stalked by something. When you're looking and out of the corner of your eye you think you see someone, and then you turn and there's no one there. Maybe there's a coat rack or something.
Or like that feeling that you're in a dream and it's dark and somebody's chasing you or following you around, but you can't quite see them, but they're there. That feeling is there. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Sort of like that, except it was non-localized. And little things, little lines in movies and things would spike the fear, but I wouldn't be able to understand it with my mind. What was this? And as that started to happen, I also had an amazing amount of fear in my body, but I couldn't figure out what I was afraid of. And it was lodged in my solar plexus, and it was there from the time I woke up to the time I went to sleep. So what I concluded, because it was sort of like also the feeling when you've done something that your conscience doesn't approve of, and you feel that you have to write it just as soon as you can. Let's say you said a little lie to somebody, and you just feel horrible. You can't rest until you go tell them, that wasn't true. There was also a feeling like that, like there was, I described it at the time like a shard of glass in the center of my being that just had to work itself out. And so, like a good girl raised on the scientific method, and I was a big journaler at the time, I started going over the year prior to see where had I stepped away from the truth, because I had experiences in my life of going down the wrong path and feeling that feeling. And so I journaled in detail, trying to figure out what was it I did, what's wrong, am I supposed to be with this person, am I not supposed to be pregnant, but nothing, there was nothing there that, it was deeper than circumstance. And to have something in your body after, 38 years of life, to have a certain sort of experience and all of a sudden to have another one, an unpleasant one, that doesn't go away. And increasingly no one can give you an answer to what's going on. The mind that likes to be in control and likes to have reference points and likes to kind of feel like the mover and the shaker, is suddenly in the back seat screaming, this car is moving without me and it's moving to places I don't know. And so my mind sped up and it would spin in circles attempting to find a solution. Or spin in circles, what am I going to do? Am I going to marry? Am I not going to marry? What can I do, basically? And that process, actually, the way that my mind responded, is often the way people's minds respond when they go into some kind of situation that is out of their control. The mind speeds up and scrambles around and climbs the walls and tries to figure things out, but there's no information. It's sort of like a hungry mind with no food, which freaks the body out further. So it was a crazy kind of all day long. What's wrong? What is this? What can I do? Oh my God, what's wrong with me? That kind of thing.
It might even be fair to say that you probably lived a good 38 years as someone other than who you really were. And coming across, in your words, what I'm about to read here, really sums up, I think, the reality of the beginning of what perhaps you were experiencing, which is the breaking away of an old self that really wasn't you in the first place. And here's what it says. As I was no longer performing the self I had been, and as my mind struggled with and was bested by this conundrum, I watched the good partner die, the contributing community member die, the one who knows, and the one who can find the truth die. More and more I was simply left in the present with no plan or strategy with which to approach anything.
Exactly.
And I think as I read that, and as you were describing, of course, what you were saying here, that it's sort of like you're giving people an opportunity to say, have you really been living authentically who you are, or did you put a really nice mask on and find a way to adapt different personalities that felt like they might work so that you could go along and just be accepted? Is that kind of what you feel that you were beginning to experience in this dark night plunge?
Well, in a way, I was somebody from very young, and even a poem in our high school yearbook that I wrote was all about being real and all about being authentic. And I was very much, as far as I knew, an authentic, truth-speaking person who was very interested in what her true path was and her true everything was. So the levels at which we are not living our true self get, in a certain way, how do I say, even to be an authentic person is to still be a person. And the true identity or the true core of what we are has no person to it. And so to live as an authentic person is still a level of a lie to the degree that unconsciously we believe, and I believed, that I was a separate, isolated unit powered by my own will, so to speak. And so it wasn't a matter of being like a faker and trying to please my dad by doing this or please my mom by doing that. Or it was a much deeper issue. It wasn't in the personality. It was actually the personality itself. I like to say it felt like there was a lie at the core of my being. It turned out the lie was my very identity as a Jeannie Zandi.
Mm-hmm. Now, as I'm reading on your blog, given that therapy is the most common place people reach for help in the darkness, it is vital that psychotherapists have information about this unique passage in order to treat. Okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Now, that's interesting because today it seems almost anybody can become a therapist. Almost anybody can become a life coach. And that's a real careful, slippery slope for a person to approach as a way out of perhaps this experience that you had. I'm sort of sensing that maybe you didn't go that direction, but you kind of went with this and stayed patient as much as you could to discover a way. Could you tell us about that?
Well, I was somebody who was interested really early in the connection between behavior and pain, and had discovered in my 20s that ways that I was that were suboptimal, so to speak, were coming from pain, and that if I went into that pain and released that pain, those areas of my life would clear up. And I used this not only, I discovered therapy and all kinds of things, and I was very, very active on sort of working on myself in those years. And I also completed a degree at Naropa University in transpersonal counseling psychology, thinking that that's what I wanted to do, even though I was in the computer industry. And so I used all those skills that I had learned to face what was coming up in me, because during this sort of experience, a ton of shadow material comes up. Every single identity that anyone has adopted to feel like a good person is under siege, basically, as you try to discover what's true, and you notice that the micro movements of staying with what's true are not necessarily pleasing to the world around you. The deep things that you've held, including keeping your own word, and those things start to get shaken. And so I probably did sit with a therapist at different times during that period of time, just to have some place to keep digesting the emotional material that was coming up. But there was no solution there. There was no understanding there. There was only sort of a maintenance, sort of like, help me clean the, what's coming up here. It helped me to keep digesting it. And that was certainly useful. But as I, go through the world and people find me based on my experience, and I teach, and they find me on the internet, there's a certain amount of information from someone who's been through this that really helps people. I would say because anybody can go find somebody to hold space for them to feel things. Mm-hmm. But to find someone who's actually been through the dark night and understands that this is a process, there's not anything wrong, because what happens at first is people feel oftentimes they can't do the work they used to do. Their relationships fall away. Sometimes that's what seems to come before a dark night experience is a divorce, an illness, something that makes you unable to sort of continue your life as you've lived it. And all of that you held gets challenged. It's so useful to hear you're not a screw-up, you're not a failure, that you can't get on top of this thing. This is actually an initiation or a process or a passage. So I would say that some people, I know one woman who was going through this and had contacted me and attended some of my meetings. She was far away from me. She found a therapist in her town who had been through this, and she walked in to interview her, and she said, "Oh yeah, you're having a dark night of the soul," and she just settled down and got to work.
By the way, there's a magazine over there that talks about it extensively.
Exactly. Just to see yourself, because I looked everywhere. I saw one article in a anthology, a Trutcher Putnam anthology. I think it was on depression, and I knew what I had was not depression. It was too active in agony a certain way. And I saw an article about egocide, and it was about people who had attempted suicide and then failed, and how they had awakening-like experiences, because what really wanted to die was not the body, but the ego, the crazy mind that's scrambling around trying to get on top of everything that drives us nutty. And most people who go through this kind of dark night experience definitely want to kill themselves at some point.
Wow.
Because I can't even describe the agony that is there, and I certainly did. Those big bunkers as you drive down the highway, those big bridges with all those nice concrete blocks, they looked very tempting. Just to get away from the mind.
Mm-hmm. Tell me, Jeannie, because you brought up depression again, what do you consider to be the difference between depression, as perhaps we know it clinically or in our society, and what you were experiencing?
I, up to that point, was a pretty darn highly functional human being. I was nurturing to other people. I was happy. I had lots of friends, had done my emotional work, all that kind of thing. In my life prior, I had gone through periods of depression that were, they were like short kind of things, and oftentimes related to some particular incident. I never had the kind of clinical depression that's helped by medication. I never experienced that. But my sense of depression is it's heavy. You just want to, it's like you get sort of sluggish and heavy and despairing and sort of, I associate it with a kind of a gravity. And this thing was more like being poked with a sharp stick.
Ah.
It was more of a gnawing agony at the center of my being that wasn't caused by anything. When I was young and my parents got a divorce, I went through a period of depression, that kind of thing. It was heavy. I didn't want to do anything. I didn't want to get out of bed. In the dark night, you want to do something, but nothing feels right. You want to, there can be an excessive amount of energy that's released by all the shadow material that's coming up, and you can want to do something with it, and nothing has meaning. There's no meaning. So it's a little different, I would say, sort of more of a gnawing thing than a thing that kind of shoves you underwater.
So we might understand Homer's Iliad then, in a way.
Well, this journey into darkness is reflected across cultures. My favorite is Inanna, because that one described what I went through perfectly. To go to the underworld to find her husband who's been taken there. She goes down, 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 and at different gates, she has her bracelets taken from her, she has her beauty taken from her, her youth taken from her, all these symbols of all of the qualities that make her that person. And then at the final gate, she's hung on a meat hook for who knows how long, fairy tale time, 10,000 billion years or whatever. And she rots there. This described my experience perfectly. I was being held somewhere and relieved of my worldly sense of myself. And most of the journeys into the dark have male heroes, and they're they go get the male fleece, or they have something to show for themselves after battling all these inner demons. But Inanna reflected my experience more. There wasn't really anything to show for it except for a nobodiness and a tremendous amount of love pouring out of my being, literally light. But I couldn't, show anybody my golden fleece, really.
Well, it was also much like the Book of Moses, where he was promised this holy land, and he leads these people for all these years, and in the end, he never really gets there or gets to have it.
Yeah, exactly, because the Holy Land ends up being the Holy Land within you. That's what you end up, your riches end up becoming not of this world, but of the sort of hollowed out space that's left inside you that's then filled with light, which, I wouldn't trade for any chest of gold myself.
I, for some reason, had this image just pop into my head of the movie Forrest Gump, where he's doing all the running, and everybody's running with him, and then all of a sudden he decides he doesn't want to run anymore, and now everybody's frustrated because what are they supposed to do now?
Exactly. And one of the beautiful after effects, which is puzzling to people, is the present moment becomes all there is. It becomes deep and wide and very, the sense of immediacy when you have one of those very special moments. It's like life and the moment is just shot through with this kind of aliveness and beauty. And you can no longer go anywhere else with the mind. And so there's no longer a sense of continuity of point A to point B. My life is a storyline, or even point A to point B. I'm going to start here and I'm going to go there. There's a continual, utter immersion in now, a surrender to any sort of storyline that could get going, which is exactly like you're talking about in this Forrest Gump situation. You could start running a race, get captivated by a bird, sit down by the side of the road, notice the bird, because where you were going is never as compelling as where you are.
Mm-hmm. Do you find yourself now that as you're in this place that you have, I guess, arrived at, that miracles become a little more frequent?
Well, absolutely. It feels like life is a miracle. There's a way that when the anticipating mind and the planning mind fall away and the idea of how things should be falls away, it's as though everything that's brought is a miracle. It's a miracle. When I had a meeting last night in Eugene, and I hadn't spoken there before. I knew a few of the people, but we meditated a while. And when I opened my eyes, every single being looks like a miracle. It's like, oh, look what was brought to me today. And the veils fall off. People aren't just these kind of cardboard objects moving around. They're light-filled. They're miracles. That light enfleshes, so to speak. That light is housed in these unique beings. Even if a being is sitting there completely believing that they're a piece of garbage, there's still something about the miracle of life and the way that it expresses itself that is delightful. And it's certainly true that when we get out of our own way with this separate will that would preempt the sort of natural rhythm and unfolding of this kind of, I guess what I would call holy plan or whatever. I mean, I don't know how to even say it. As we get out of the way of that, it manifests through us in ways we could never have expected. Yeah.
I know I have had the opportunity to speak with marvelous people just like yourself over the years, and unequivocally, there becomes a time that you more than understand. It's that knowing that you always hear. And I've even described, to my wife or even friends, I said, when I do shows and they begin to work through me, it's almost really, you lose yourself. And it's
exactly.
an amazing feeling, just like what we're having happen now. There's a dance that you perform, and the movements just, they're there. They just, they create themselves. And I think it's funny because you hear people that perhaps could be considered gurus or spiritual leaders, and sure, they speak the language, but until you've really experienced it, you think, no, you're speaking great poetry or philosophy here, but you're really not speaking to the true experience when this happens. And even though I don't have any judgment about that, because you wish for them to really experience that, because there's a whole different, I guess, attitude or whatever you want to call this, but it's exciting, and people know when that has happened from you, and it's obvious because people, I'm sure, do follow you and follow what you do. They're like, I know this person gets it. It isn't just philosophy. It isn't just words. It isn't just I want this to happen, but it has happened.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because when we're very much raised and conditioned to live from our minds and to use our minds as our discerning tool. So that sounds good. That sounds logical. That sounds like something a person like me would like to do, right? And we lead our lives from there. And when we start to get into spiritual territory, it's really important to use what I would call kind of the resonating instrument of the body. It's almost like below your awareness, below the things the person is saying, there's just this sense, you are food for me. And I have a very strong, I think partly because I was raised in a house with a skeptical agnostic as a dad, and he's a scientist, and you better be speaking from what you know in your experience, or you're going to get, you're going to get uncovered, right, in my house.
Mm-hmm.
And
Bunsen Burnard.
yeah, exactly. Put in a test tube and change into something else. And so here there's a deep commitment that wasn't made by my mind or my will to only speak from my experience, because there's a certain resonant energy from a being who is speaking from their experience. There's something deeply trustworthy about it it's like in the kind of instrument of our bodies. We just say yes. And right now in our culture, awakening, enlightenment, all that is being sold, and it's being, and those terms have been taken from a kind of a deeply reverent, rare, and not to say that every being doesn't have the capacity. That's not what I mean by rare, but that kind of feeling of this is a precious thing we have reverence for. We don't use this word unless it really means what it means. And there are many, many people entitling their events, the awakening of this, and being enlightened that, and everyone offers what they have to offer to the best of their ability. But I think right now it's so important for people to not believe what everybody else says or the marketing or the hype or anything, but to really drop into their bodies and feel, is this a being that feels alive with something that I'm hungry for?
Mm-hmm. Well, and you bring up to me something that I think even our listeners could take an opportunity to observe when you talk about these people who proclaim to be the enlightened ones, sending you on the true, authentic path to your whatever it is. I mean, you see the language, and as you just said, it's slung around with a certain vibrato that's maybe in advertising campaigns now, but that the people who actually go, even sometimes in groups, they become groupies around these people like they're little rock stars, and and they hang on every word this person says as though it's the most profound thing that's ever happened. And you have to say, well, look, I'm glad if you think this is working for you, but you're really missing the point. The idea isn't to follow this perceived light of the world all over the place, but to become that yourself. Wouldn't that be the way to look at it?
Well, I would say absolutely, but I want to say that I had, toward the end of this, a couple teachers, mm-hmm. and I was so grateful and so deeply assisted by, and I tend to be a devotional human being anyway. I mean, I tend to be devotional toward my daughter, my cat, my whatever it is. If I love it, I serve it. You know what I'm saying? And mm-hmm. and so, and this teacher was a teacher that woke up in Zen Buddhism and is a very humble, plain-speaking kind of person. But the love and gratitude that I felt toward him, and the accuracy and clarity and the rarity of that in the teachers that I had seen was so valuable to me that so there can be a true devotion that reflects a kind of deep quality and deep service that some of these beings actually are. They're not in a cave. They are going, despite oftentimes tremendous assaults to their health. They're right. Traveling, they're teaching, they're giving, their whole being. It's utterly a service. They're like a candle. It's just burning at both ends until it burns out, just giving this light to the world. And for beings like that, and when one feels in one's heart that the being before you is not just a rock star, but a servant of humanity on behalf of mm-hmm. the deepest gifts and values that of the spirit, there is a natural devotion. There's a natural willingness to want to lay down a puddle and let them walk on you, because they're laying themselves down on the puddle to let the entire humanity walk over them. And so there can be a true devotion. The trouble is that people are looking to offload their responsibility for their own unfolding onto someone else, make them super shiny, make them hold their own shininess so that they can stay sort of dopey and feel like they're getting somewhere. And I would say anybody who promises to take anybody anywhere is full of garbage, and because in the present you're not thinking about where you're going. You're not thinking about taking anyone else there either. You're there and you're giving what you have to give, and I think that that quality of humility is what. There are tremendous forces when I think a lot of teachers start out wanting to give their whole heart and then get lost in how much attention comes to them. Mm-hmm. And if there's a place still in the personality feeding off that, that's going to come before the giving of the gift, and the gift may actually be obscured by that. And the whole thing, I remember going and seeing a teacher, and there was a big scene around her, and they were putting her shoes on a pillow, and I was just like, give me a break here. And yet, when you have that deep gratitude to someone for living a selfless existence, you do want to put their shoes on a pillow.
I want to make things as comfortable for you as I can because I want my own discomfort to dissipate. No, you actually made that all clearly so eloquently spoken as to, exactly my point was the idea that people do tend to follow around and as you said, what they want to do is dump the baggage on. As long as they're hanging out, then everything should be fine without taking that responsibility that it takes to take that step into the direction to be a light and to be of service to the world in your own unique way.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, there's a lot of grooviness around spirituality, and we can think that lighting the candles and, having the picture of the goddess in our room and that feel good spirituality, that's great, as long as we're aware that if we keep barking up the tree of spirit, at some point we're going to be, a deeper spirituality is going to come and invite us into it. And that's the one where actually the structure of the separate self gets taken apart, and that's no party.
And you were in that party for, 4 years?
I was in that partyless party, yeah.
Did you ever feel there was a point where, how much longer do I need to do this? Because 4 years is quite a long time.
Well, I never had a sense that had an end. I never had a sense of what it was. So at the beginning, a lot of my suffering was around, when will this end? What is this? How do I make it end? I had no sense that it had an end. And so it was when, if you can imagine having a sort of a hostile takeover of your psyche, so that it's almost like being claustrophobic in your own body. It's not somewhere you want to be anymore. That after a while there was a kind of a resignation that came, and it was a hard one, resignation. Rilke talks about wrestling with your angel. It's a metaphor from the Old Testament where the kind of the higher aspect of one's being comes and wrestles with the lower aspect, which is very much like a creature. It wants to survive, to survive through the ongoing, understood, reliable nature of itself. That there was a lot, and there usually is a lot of fighting, a lot of wrestling with what is, a lot of really duking it out, this isn't going on, how can I solve this, how can I get away from this? And it was when I really gave up. I hadn't found anything to tell me what was happening to me, really. I hadn't found any way to make it stop. And after a while, there was something in me that said, okay, maybe I'll be like this for the rest of my life. I can't do anything about it. So, and I saw that the suffering was coming from the very fight that was happening inside of me. And so what I started to do was I let my attention drop out of the fight in my mind and out of my will into very concrete aspects of the present moment, like the feeling of the chair under me, the feeling of the wind on my face. And I started to I got basically driven into the present moment, and I started just putting one foot in front of the other with no sense of anything ever changing. I gave over to it, not from any virtue, but from utter exhaustion. And there was a moment where there was a silence in that place of just putting one foot in front of the other. There was a place outside the mind that sort of beckoned, and I remember my mind screamed. As I looked at my mind for the first time, I was not my mind. My mind was sort of over here in my left hand. I was looking at it, and it was screaming, we got to figure this out. We got to, get busy, get back here. And there was something repeating. It just said, you are not my friend, and what would it be like to live without you? And because I was getting an increasing sense that I could actually move through the day without going there at all. And as I considered that, the mind screamed, you will be alone, you will be mentally ill, you will be dead.
Wow. That mind rolled, didn't it?
Yeah, and that was that was the end of that. Really.
That's okay. You go ahead and do your own thing. I'm going to keep feeling the ground beneath my feet.
Exactly. So I would say that every single day there was the feeling, when will this end? When will this end? When will this end? What did I do wrong? Why does God hate me? Where is God? All that kind of stuff. When will this end? And I think the thing goes on. It seems like it has a little bit of a sense of humor. It's almost like as long as you're wondering when it's going to end, you're going to get more until you go belly up completely.
Mm-hmm. Do you suppose, Jeannie, that, for people who suffer addiction, and I don't mean just the people who, maybe, who knows, like the Lindsay Lohan or whatever the case is, where they kind of bounce in and out of it, but I mean the true hardcore people. I mean, they just drove their life into the ground. That perhaps that this is what was actually happening to them, and their addiction was just a way to soothe the torment, just as what you were describing.
Absolutely.
So you do. So it isn't really, because I think one of the things that I've really challenged on this program, whether it's alcoholism or drug addiction, it's all addiction one way or the other, but like in alcoholism specifically, is the ideal that it's a disease. Now, it's a way to look at it, I suppose, but I looked at it more as a pattern of emotional thinking, that that you step away from it, and perhaps things will change when you come to terms with why that happens. That addiction is part of an emotional cycle more than a disease. But what would you say to something like that?
Well, I don't understand. I know I studied it once, but I retain very little anymore of that sort of thing. I can't call up the physiology, though I've read about it, about that certain bodies are more susceptible to certain addictions, alcohol being one of them. But there's my daughter. There's alcoholism on her dad's side, quite severe alcoholism. Mm-hmm. And my daughter's 14 now, and she's a very fully functioning human being. And she has absolutely no interest in substances, as her friends around her are starting to experiment, because she loves being here in the moment so much. It's yummy. When you have suffering, when you have emotional suffering, it's not yummy to be here, and you use anything that you can to get through it. And I don't know if there's an element of alcoholism that is, if you were feeling absolutely peachy and wonderful and there was no conflict at the core of your being, would you want to get drunk?
Right.
I can't say because I just really don't know, but I would venture a guess that we're basically addicted to our minds, all of us. That's the primary addiction. We're addicted to sort of doing and figuring out and thinking, and that is the primary way that we try to escape what is at the very core of our beings a conflict, a war, a sense of, Thoreau called it all men lead lives of quiet desperation. I like to joke, and women lead lives of expressive desperation. But that feeling of not enough, this is not quite right, there's something wrong with me, there's something wrong with my life, I don't feel nourished, I feel hungry, that kind of hungry ghost thing. That is basically just simply the core of separation, the very root of why we go searching and running and medicating and numbing. It's agony. It is agony to be separated or to feel separate from your divine nature. It's agony.
And the idea that we ever thought that there was something about us that was imperfect in the first place, when a loving God gives you a soul with everything that you need, and then you have the idea that you think that was imperfect in the first place and needs to be repaired. And when you really step away from that thinking and you realize where those messages actually came from, maybe it's time to rise and challenge that whole ideal and just kind of move your own direction in the first place. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I do think that the design of the human being includes imperfection. So we're basically these dear mortal things that limp, even the best of us, because even if we get to 80 or 90, we're gonna falter, right? This body decays. There is an aspect of us that is human and frail and limited. We lose our temper. We do things we don't intend. We parent ways we never thought we would, et cetera, et cetera. There's a fallibility to the human instrument that is dear and is intended in a certain way. And we get confused about where the perfection lies. And so there is an imperfection and a mortality that, when surrendered to, the true perfection shines through, the perfection of the beauty of the love of the holy, basically, which is the core of ourselves. And there's nothing so beautiful as a being who has utterly accepted their humanness and yet hasn't thrown out the divinity, that they are both there and both accepted. There's they're not on high. I think of the model of Jesus as a being like this. There's a willingness to walk with the prostitutes and to get muddy and to get on one's knees down with the people. But there's also this beautiful exaltedness from the true nature that shines through. And when we try to take the human aspect of us and say, I will go easy on myself and other people will go easy on me when I get there, when I perfect this, but until I can never lie, never cheat, never steal, never fall down, never fail, I will deny myself kindness, and I will allow other people to be unkind to me because, after all, I'm imperfect. That quest for perfection is fishy, the one that says, I don't get to live here in the moment until I'm good enough. That's the ill perfection. Mm-hmm. But there's also a drive in beings who love divine qualities to allow a complete surrender to the beauty of our holiness to penetrate every area of our living. That sort of perfection is a it's like a kindness to oneself and others, and a deep desire, not born from trying to earn anyone's approval, but that deep desire to actually embody what you know to be the possibility of a human being. That's like that, to me, that's a beautiful perfecting process that happens as people discover deeply who they are, and every aspect of life is penetrated by that love.
It sure is exciting to be alive. There's no doubt about that. Now, I know that you do travel around the United States, and I'm guessing around the world from time to time. Do you have workshops people can find out more about these things?
Yeah, I usually I do public talks in various places, and then I do longer retreats. And I'm moving right now from New Mexico to Colorado, and so we haven't scheduled beyond the end of the year, but we have a retreat out in the Bay Area in November, and we have a retreat that we're just in the planning stages between Christmas and New Year's. And I do regular travels about, and so people can find me through my website. There's a lot of, and on Facebook, which is more current, because I don't have a big staff. Maybe someday. I had an assistant for a month and a half. That was really great.
Did she keep your shoes on a pillow?
No pillows, nothing like that. But so people can plug in there. The Facebook page is Living is Love, the work of Jeannie Zandi. I also have a personal page, but that's like for my cousins and the kids I went to elementary school with. But the work one is Living is Love, and they're in the notes section of that. So we post the events to that page. There's also a notes section in there that has some transcriptions of things that I've spoken, and on the website, which is just my name, JeannieZandi.com, there's a section called Excerpts, and it has some articles, and it has, I think, a couple videos, and so there's a way to get a bit of me even from your armchair.
There you go.
And sometimes I do conference calls that people can call in on, and that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm around.
Well, Jeannie, we want to thank you for being around today to join us here on the Beyond 50 radio program, because as I was mentioning earlier, a lot of times people will get to their midlife and they'll just feel this sense of dissatisfaction and the sense of, geez, I didn't feel that my life would have been here. I thought it would be somewhere else. And it may not be a dark night of the soul journey like yours was, but it's always encouraging to know that people such as yourself have been through a tremendous experience like that. And when you come out on the other side, that, as I like to continually say, right where you are is where you should be. Take that next step in the direction you think you want to be.
Yeah,
and I would see what happens.
I would say follow that divine discomfort. Don't medicate it. Don't run away from it. Don't try to solve it. Listen to it.
And you don't need to walk across the bed of hot coals to experience that. It's already there.
It's already there. That's right. The bed of hot coals in your own chair.
Well, Jeannie, thank you so much again for joining us. It was truly a pleasure to have you here on the program today.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much. It was fun.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there. If you want to find out more about this, be sure to visit us at beyond50radio.blogspot.com. We're going to have a post up there for you as well. Thank you again for joining us. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis, and remember, live your day past.